Okay, let's take a brief look at our discussion questions. I'm just going to kind of just give a quickie little overview kind of deal here. So we've got two up there right now. I might put up a couple more, but let's take a look at these. So the first one here is philosophical questions and answers. This one is intended to be kind of fun, possibly. At the very least, it's kind of your ideas on what kind of philosophical questions are of interest to you. And, somebody else, the idea here is somebody else is supposed to go do research for you on something that you are genuinely interested in knowing about. That's kind of cool. The other side of it, of course, is that you're going to do research for somebody else on something that they're interested in. So it's kind of like a little knowledge exchange. So that's the idea, and let's go for it. I think that's kind of a cool thing, really. Um, so let me say this. I wanted to leave it pretty open in terms of like what philosophical question you might pose as what you're interested in. Um, I guess one thing, like you want it to be like a philosophical question. Like there's all kinds of. Do human beings have free will? Did time begin? Are ethics relative? What constitutes the identity of a person over time? I mean, these are some classic philosophical questions. But what's the meaning of life? Is there such a thing as enlightenment? Um, what is death? How do we know if God exists? All kinds of questions. And those are just standard philosophical questions. I wanted to open it up to, deep probing questions of your own about life. But, let's make them deep. So just that as a caveat. I'm not really planning to grade people on the depth or philosophicality of their questions, but let's make them philosophical. If you wanted to get an idea of, well, gosh, what counts as a philosophical question, you can pop around my website, or you can just like Google philosophical questions, philosophy, just see what's out there. But you probably got some deep probing questions about the mind or the world or ethics or whatever. But yeah, thinking philosophical. So there you go. So there's two posts for this first one. Like the first one, you just make your question: do human beings have free will? That's just an example. Um, what is a number? You ever think about that? What is a number? Do they really exist? So just put the question and maybe like a little, blurb. This could be a blurb on why you picked that question. But the first thing is just putting up your question. Then you go find somebody else's question that's of interest to you. Do a little research on this. That's a key requirement for the assignment. You go do some research for them. Leave the links that you found best and say what was going on there. And say what answer these links and your research led you to. Now this doesn't have to be definitive. It doesn't have to be right. This is just where the research led you on balance to think the answer to the question is. So check it out. So that's that. I'm thinking like a page, page and a half is about what you'd do there. All right. So that's pretty open ended. It's supposed to be fun. I don't really know what your idea of fun is, but it might be. You can make it fun. Okay. The other one is a kind of a comparative question about two seemingly very different views of wisdom. I say seemingly, so I'll say more about that in a second. Here, these are based on reading. You want to read 2.2 and 2.4. That's the Four Noble Truths and Plato's Apology, respectively. Socratic wisdom, we're going to take from the Apology. Socrates specifically talks about wisdom there and how he arrived at his particular definition of wisdom. So that's the deal there. 2.2, 2.4. and give a brief account of both of them and do a little comparative analysis. And which one do you really think is more compelling to you? What seems like the kind of more compelling account of human wisdom? They seem totally different. So that means there's a genuine question as to which of these is right, or maybe we would just say best, or kind of more persuasive to you, given that they seem to be pretty different. I mean, I'll just kind of open this up a little bit. Um, Socrates said that he was led to the following account of what wisdom is by his encounter with the oracle at Delphi. And it said, no one is wiser than Socrates. You can hear more about this on my little video thing on the apologies. See that on the study guide. Um, but, that's what he gets. No one is wiser than Socrates. Um, and he's like, dude, how can that be? I don't know anything. I don't take myself to know anything important about the nature of truth, justice, or beauty, or anything important. So how can no one be wiser than me? And he realized that what wisdom is actually to recognize your lack of it. Or we might better say, better yet, to be wise is to recognize that you are bereft of knowledge, that you don't know the important things about human life. And realizing your lack of knowledge is what constitutes wisdom. And that's really different from a view of wisdom that says, here are these fundamental important truths. Knowing these things, these fundamental truths about human life, that's what it is to be wise. Socrates is totally not saying that. He's saying that to be wise is to recognize that you don't have that. There's no stock of truths that we can say constitute wisdom, and realizing that is to be wise. So looking at Buddha, you know, he's got the Four Noble Truths, and he says these are like the four central truths about human life. So he's saying, look, here, understanding these four truths is to be wise. And a lot goes into really understanding them, what they're all about, and so on and so forth. But these are the truths that constitute wisdom, understanding them. You can see already that seems totally different from what Socrates says. Socrates says to be wise is to recognize that you don't have any truths to know. Buddha says, well, I got at least four of them. So they seem to be saying pretty different things, at least on the surface. Now, let me just kind of like intimate or suggest this, why this might just be on the surface. One thing about Buddhism that you can see in the 2.2 reading, the part on the Fourth Noble Truth, there's this distinction between, what is it, knowing accordingly and penetration. Penetration is the deeper form of understanding, and it's an understanding without words. So there's no linguistic content to your understanding when you've achieved true mental penetration into the nature of reality. That understanding isn't described in words. That raises interesting questions of its own. We won't get into those now. In particular, how can you describe penetration if you have to use words to describe this non-linguistic understanding? Okay, let's not get too worried about that now. But now here's where things kind of get interesting. Socrates says there's no linguistic formulation of the truth about justice, beauty, or virtue that anyone can claim to have. And even though Buddha says, look, we've got these Four Noble Truths, he also seems to be saying there's no single linguistic formulation of them that's the right one, because that's just knowing accordingly, and the real wisdom comes in penetration. So maybe they're not that far apart at that point. You might need to listen to this again to kind of totally get that. But maybe they're closer than they seem. On the other hand, maybe they're not. Okay, another difference is that Socrates, despite thinking that we never get wisdom, is all about intellectual activity and contemplation and thinking, even though you're not going to get it. And Buddhism is kind of like get off the train of intellectual thought in order to get wisdom. And that again seems to be a pretty significant difference. So there you go.